All right, so my name is Candice Ruttner-Duryea, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I work in San Diego, California. I am the CEO of Beautiful Minds Family Counseling Clinic. To think about, we can start with the brain. We'll start there. And neurofeedback and this new way of looking at our brain or scanning our brain. I compare it to like if you 100 years ago had broken your arm, you and yourself most likely, or others around you, you and others around you would have to do hard labor. And so if you broke your arm, that was devastating to your livelihood, to your family. And they did have your body so amazing, which it just really still even blows my mind how incredible it is that a doctor could probably feel where the break was and then splint it for you, and your body would heal that. Your bone, a major structure of your body, would heal. I mean, that's just incredible. In the meantime, you would lose some function, most likely, and you would have pain, residual pain. But you didn't just stop working. Most people would figure out another way to do what they needed to do. We're very intuitive. We're very, we definitely try to overcome a lot of times, and so we just wouldn't stop. You might stop. You might have to have other people come in and take that place, but most likely you continued on in a different way doing that hard labor. Fast forward 50 years and you break your arm, and X-ray machines came along, and they could not only see where the break was, and they had excellent casting systems too. They could find exactly where that break was, they could set it, and then they could put on a very excellent cast. And the doctor's job at that point is to find the exact points and then set your body in position that it can do its healing process. And so if you think about the brain in that very simple way, which is a very hard thing to do, but it has the same property and principle. It's oriented towards healing. It's oriented towards stabilizing you and helping you to stay safe. That's what its job is. Sometimes not so good. And when it's oriented and we have submission to proper truth and logic, very good. It can do very well for you by God's grace. So neurofeedback on the brain is the way that the brain talks amongst different parts of itself is through impulses of electricity and blood flow. These two things occur very simultaneously. The reason I can do my movements is because these are little electrical impulses from my body, as well as blood flow to each area. So they work in tandem. And a lot of the medical experience has been to have, look at a brain and see what the blood flow is. That's very helpful, very, very helpful for physically damaged areas. But when you have something that's occurred and it's caused a stress response, that doesn't always show up in the physical areas. That oftentimes shows up in the language, how the brain talks to each other. And so when you look at a brain map, oftentimes you'll see how the language of the brain happens. And those are cool. They're called EEGs, and they're pretty nice. But they don't really tell you what the brain's doing when it's stressed. And in fact, the scans that we do are kind of one of the only ones that actually have this technology that gives you what's called a P300 waveform measurement. It actually gives the brain a small snapshot of the stress response when the brain is given randomized controls or randomized testing. And in that, the brain is able then to go, oh, this is interesting, it's different. And it happens in such a short period of time, like 1,000th of a millisecond. And the caps capture that, and the brain goes right back to its standard waveform or communication. And so in that, then we can look at, we do that about 40 times, and then we look at how many times the brain presented itself this way. And we have a good consistent basis to show this is what your brain does when it's stressed. A lot of brain and EEG measurements just do what's called a nice open or a nice closed. And that's EEG measurements, and then they try to compare. And that's sometimes accurate about half the time, but it's not enough, I don't think, to kind of have a large amount of investment in a scan, and neither does the medical community. They normally invest in the EEG for something that's called seizure responses. And those are very helpful for those because they can see the areas of the brain and they can be able to know how that function is permitting you to not function well. So when we get a map and we kind of see what the brain is doing when it's stressed, then we're able to look at where we need to give the brain information about itself. So in neurofeedback, those waveforms, those electrical impulses that move over the brain, that's the language and helps it talk to each other. We look to see where that's not functioning well, or the language isn't quite going well, or not having a lot of it, or maybe we don't have waveform submission during stress like we wouldn't have in the prefrontal. And then we use electrical equipment such as headphones, televisions, tactile devices that buzz, that give the brain its information in electrical impulses right back to it in real time. So it's just mirroring it. And when that happens, by some amazing grace, the brain knows that that's its own perfect waveform. It knows that that's itself. And when it knows that, just like when the bone is matched up just perfectly from a broken arm, when the brain is encountered in this very unique way, its own waveform in real time, it starts making corrections. Why, how, we have no clue on that at this point. We just don't. It's just too vast. But we know that it happens. And just like we know that the rest of the body that happens in, this is the very similar principle. And so that's what we use the neurofeedback for, is we use the scan to see what this stress actually is doing. And then we use the neurofeedback to give the brain the information about that stress, and it starts to make changes. It was discovered in the 1970s when they were doing subcortical seizure training. They were actually looking at brains and the seizure response and giving that feedback. And they were just looking to see first what the brain, what the brain could do with the response. And they were just measuring it. And then over time, what started to happen is that the seizure response lessened, which was unheard of. How does that happen, right? And then if they did it for long enough, the seizure response disappeared. And that was that's kind of what started, like the brain can learn itself. That's so incredible, right? But if you think about it, like we're having this conversation, or the people who are listening to this is all new information. And it is being pushed in some measure by some of those little waveforms. And your brain is taking it in through all your senses, and it's learning from it. And so would it do that with its own response in a very kind of simple way? Turns out, yes, it does. It's kind of incredible. And it totally gives a new meaning to renew your mind in a lot of senses, right? If your mind is able to not have a fearful state, if it can see that it's fearful, that the waveform is off, which is mostly what's presented in fear, the brain goes, oh, that's not so right. And the person during neurofeedback typically calms. And when that happens, then they get to be aware of themselves a whole lot more. One of the most common things that people talk about when we're doing this is that they're finally calm enough or present enough to make the changes they want to make. The best experience, I would say, in treatment is when someone we live in the state of California. I feel like I'm right in the footsteps of Sodom and Gomorrah. We live in California. We're not allowed to talk about our faith. We're not allowed to bring it into a verbal representation in a lot of ways. So we bring it in a physical representation and an aesthetic. It's all over the place. When you walk into an office with me or with my lovely team, oh, this is place where Christ is for some reason. These people must believe in Christ somehow. And so when someone starts to be calm and they start to feel better, the most amazing thing is to see them then want to know about Christ, and from all walks of life. And that is, to see that God does that on his own. One of my favorite ones is, a lot of times someone will come in and they'll say, okay, I have to tell you, I've had this type of experience, and I want to know how does this work with spirituality, or how does this work with God? And that happens so often in the middle of this place, in the middle of people just coming in for treatment to feel better, and not expecting or not even balking at it. And so that's been quite amazing. But to learn from the most difficult of experiences is to be when I've not been able to be there enough for a patient, when I haven't been sufficient in something that I've been able to help or treat. That probably has been one of the most difficult things to confront. The Lord always reminds me, and I've been blessed in a lot of ways, even in those places where I've had people who've just been so generous in response post, not maybe in the moment, but maybe afterwards, where they've said, even though this didn't work out in this way, something must have happened because it worked out amazing over here. And so I'm always reminded that even in my biggest failures, that God never gives up, and he has, even in that, he uses that for his great purpose. And so, yeah, that's definitely probably one of my, even facing that failure of my own and knowing that the Lord will do something with it, it still bears a sorrow.